My name is Susanna Karp, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director of Cleantech for Europe. We're an initiative of trailblazers, very focused on developing, deploying, and investing in clean technology innovation here in the European Union. We have launched several coalitions this year in 2022. One coalition being indeed of scale-up innovators in the European Union, an investor coalition that we've been working with, but also a coalition of policymakers interested in finding out exactly how can we move faster in Europe with developing the sort of technology landscape that is needed for reaching our carbon neutrality goals. So I'll be talking very much on the topics of the briefing from this perspective. And I'm actually here joined with a stellar panel, panel. And I'd like to first of all welcome Thomas Pellerin-Carlin, who has traveled from Paris this morning to be here with us. Thank you very much. He's the director for the EU program at the Institute for Climate Economics in Paris. Next to him is Domien van Genechten, who's a policy advisor at E3G's Brussels office. He has been following the ETS for very many years, so he will be actually taking over the moderation of the session. Now, to the right of the panel, we have Camille Maury, who's a senior policy advisor of WWF. And Camille, together with her colleagues, they have recently launched a report looking into the EU ETS free allowances. So it's the most recent analysis of a topic that's, of course, been looked at, but now we have the latest number estimates with taking into account the latest carbon prices as well. And next to her is Agnese Ruggiero, who is a policy advisor at Carbon Market Watch, the NGO that has built a name over more than a decade for being a watchdog of the EU's carbon market, and who will share with us some important elements that we should all keep in mind when we follow the trialogues this weekend. We also have a speaker joining us online. Good morning, Ola Hansson, who's in Sweden at the moment, and thanks for joining us. He is the Director of Public Affairs for H2 Green Steel, who is a company innovating exactly in the sectors that we would need to see rapid innovation in, one of the sectors covered by the EU ETS. And he will therefore share his perspective on what they're following from the perspective of such an innovator company looking into the trialogues this weekend. So that having been said, I would like to actually invite Domien to take over the moderation of the panel, but first to ask you a question, which is, could you tell us, a bit, walk us through the basics of the EU ETS? Why is this important? How does the system work? There are journalists online tuning in from the member states. So what are, kind of the basics of the EU ETS? Thanks.
Thanks, Susanna, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, I guess, everyone has heard the phrase before that the EU ETS is the cornerstone of EU climate policy. It's, the flagship climate policy was launched in 2005. It was meant to help us achieve, or the EU achieve, its domestic climate targets and its international climate targets. It was also the first and largest carbon market in the world. As such, it has a big example role. Lots of other countries across the world that are looking into carbon pricing, into carbon markets, are looking at the EU as a front runner, as a first of a kind. And lastly, and that is very important, it is meant to put one of the EU's most core principles of environmental policy at the heart of its climate policy, which is the polluter pays principle. How the ETS works, it's relatively simple in a way, or the idea is very simple. You decide on a target, on an overall amount of emissions. You allow your economy to emit a so-called cap on the amount of emissions. You translate that cap into emission permits, into emission allowances, which your covered entities, being big polluting industries, such as power utilities, such as heavy industry, can get their hands on, and they either get them for free or they can purchase them through auctioning. And then afterwards, those entities can buy and sell those allowances, creating a market, creating a carbon price, and it's that carbon price signal that is meant to drive investments in emission reduction technologies and reduce emissions overall. So as I said, the ETS was born 17 years ago, almost celebrating its 2 decades anniversary. And I think this is the fourth large revision of the ETS. The last one was only concluded in late 2017, not that long ago. And I think it's important to highlight that that was in a very different context. If you remember the mid-2010s, the carbon price was low, was very low, was about €5 a ton. And those revisions were very much aimed at sort of fixing the ETS. It wasn't driving any emission reductions, really. It was plagued by an oversupplied market. There were way too many allowances in the market available for, well, necessary to cover emissions. And well, all in all, like those past revisions were quite successful. I think in the last 4 years, we've seen a tremendous uptick in the price of the ETS, in the confidence in the market. And so the context we find ourselves in today is, on the one hand, from the ETS perspective at least, very positive. We have a robust carbon price signal. Emissions have been declining quite rapidly over the last years, not taking into account the COVID crisis and an economic crisis right now. But the external context is a lot more challenging. We have a war at our doorsteps here in the EU. We are battling a fossil fuel price crisis, an inflation crisis. One of our big trading partners, the US, has finally gotten a big climate policy, which is very great. I mean, it should be applauded. But on the other hand, it is also adding pressure to Cleantech and to decarbonization investments in Europe. And that is something that negotiators all have in the back of their heads right now, and trying to flesh out and put the puzzle together in order to come up with a solid compromise over the weekend. From my side, or where I'm sitting, I'm not going to go very much into the different scenarios or what the outcomes might be, but I see three main buckets, so to speak, in the negotiations this weekend. And that also explains, I mean, those buckets are very much interlinked to other parts of EU's climate policy. So on the one hand, it's industrial decarbonization. The ETS has worked very well for power sector emissions. It has done, or incentivized a lot of fuel switching in those utilities. But for heavy industry sectors, which are supposedly at risk of carbon leakage, we have had free allocation for the last 15 years. I think what is remarkable about this revision is that for the first time, the EU and negotiators are serious about ending free allocation eventually. This is where the link is with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, obviously, which was, well, we had a provisional agreement on Tuesday morning. But I think the political elite or the policymakers are behind the idea now that we need to move away from free allocation to CBAM eventually over time. Big question still about how fast that will be. But that is a big shift in EU climate policy. Secondly, and to put it very plainly, it's about money. The ETS is becoming a gigantic financial instrument as well. Auctioning revenues this year will amount to about 30 billion. Financial value of the ETS this decade is about 1 trillion euros. That is a gigantic redistribution exercise, which has made this all very political. And my colleagues will delve deeper into that. But that is also where the link, for example, to REPowerEU comes in, because policymakers see this big pot of money. And in times of crisis or when something happens, it is very easy to reach out to the ETS and use those revenues for other purposes, which is, from a policymaking stand of view, like maybe understandable, but also poses quite a few threats. And I will have colleagues here as well that will delve deeper into that. And then lastly, although not the focus of this press briefing, a lot of the negotiations will be about expanding the scope of the ETS to other sectors. Within the current ETS, we're talking about aviation, we're talking about maritime shipping, we're talking about waste incineration. But the big contentious ones, obviously, is the second ETS on road transport and buildings, which then explains the link to the Social Climate Fund, which will also be negotiated this weekend, where, I mean, the rationale behind having a social climate fund is to mitigate some of those negative impacts on the most vulnerable among us, the vulnerable households. So that really shows why the ETS is still that cornerstone of EU climate policy. It might not be the main driver, but it is linked to every other aspect of EU climate policy, meaning that this revision and these negotiations are crucial and can make or break EU climate ambition more broadly. I will stop here and turn to my colleagues now, who will dive a bit deeper into some of those core elements. They will try to unpack some of those possible scenarios for the negotiation outcomes this weekend, and will give their 2 cents on what they will be looking out for, what is important for them, and what good and bad looks like. So I'll first turn to Thomas. I've already alluded to US climate policy. I think we are entering a sort of new era where we're not talking anymore about carbon leakage as much as green investment leakage almost. And I know you've been following that very closely, so very keen to hear your take on this.
Thank you, Domin. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Thomas. I'm the EU Program Director of the Institute for Climate Economics, which is an international think tank based in Paris that, as the name suggests, works on climate economics. And we've been created alongside the Paris Climate Agreement. And so our role is really looking at how we can align financial flows and, more broadly speaking, investments in our economy to what we need to mitigate climate change internationally, in the EU and nationally, and also adapt to climate change. One element that struck me is something that happened actually a few days ago on December the 4th, when Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, went to Bruges. And for me, as a former student of the College of Europe, obviously I was keen to hear, what she had to say. And usually when politicians go to Bruges to make a big speech, it tends to be a speech about where the EU stands currently in history. That's the 1988 Margaret Thatcher speech, for instance, on her visions of the EU, also the Jacques Delors speech of '89, or the 2010 Angela Merkel speech. And Ursula von der Leyen did make that speech, and it is centered on the issue of climate action and clean technology. And one element that she said, but I really urge you to read her speech. It's only 4 pages long. If you have not done that yet, I urge you to do so. She said, and I'm quoting here, "We are now confronted with an intensifying global clean tech race." And to me, as a researcher, it's something that we've been witnessing in international economics over the past, let's say, 2.5, 3 years, when China, but also the US, decided to go for climate neutrality as being the long-term target, and then started to align some of their policy tools, especially investment, in order to deliver that. And one thing that is absolutely important when we look at the EU action in that global clean tech race is the EU power to regulate. And that's one key element of the Fit for 55. But what is historically lacking for the EU, but plentiful in the US and China, is money, investments. And the ETS is particularly interesting from that perspective, because it's about carbon pricing to direct private investment in specific sectors, but also that carbon pricing creates revenues that the EU, through the Innovation Fund, especially, but also member states can use to subsidize, whatever they want. One key evolution that happened over the summer was the adoption of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. And as often in US politics, the name of the bill does not tell you what it is about. IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, is about clean tech and climate. Obviously, you don't put a big headline climate element in the US if you want Joe Manchin to vote in favor of that. But I want to compare let's say 3 elements in the Inflation Reduction Act and compare that to ETS free allowances. I want to talk about the time horizon first, then about the amount of money, and then about the focus area. If we look at the time horizon, IRA in the US and the discussion we have on ETS free allowances is quite similar. Both of them share a commonality, which is looking at the long term. The Inflation Reduction Act is supposed to be implemented, will be implemented from January 1st, 2023, and most of its provisions will end between 2030 and 2032. So we're looking about a 10-year horizon. In the EU, when we talk about ETS free allowances, we're also in a similar time horizon, starting to phase out free allowances between 2025 and 2027, depending on the positions, and giving visibility on that phase out until, let's say, the early 2030s. The second element that IRA and ETS free allowances share in common is the amount of money. The Inflation Reduction Act in the US that has been voted is estimated to be a push of $386 billion for clean technology products. If we want to put that on an annual basis, I'm just going to oversimplify things a bit. Just keep in mind the number 40 billion per year. That's roughly speaking the amount of spending that you have inside the Inflation Reduction Act. If we look at ETS free allowances and we look at the amounts of allowances that are being given for free to specific companies, and we transform that not in CO2 emissions, but in euros at the current market price, we also happen to find that it's around 40 billion euros per year. So the amount the US is investing through IRA and the amount the EU is spending, the US and its member states is spending in terms of free allowances is very similar. In both cases, it's around 40 billion euros per year. And so therefore, I'm coming to my third point, which is the big difference, is the focus area. In the US, the focus area is clearly on clean tech investment. Most of the money from IRA will go in the form of tax credits for renewable electricity. It will also go in the form of tax credits for the production of green hydrogen. And therefore, one major component of the Inflation Reduction Act are production subsidies. So the US subsidizes production in the US of clean electricity, clean hydrogen, batteries, all those kind of clean technologies. And it is also investing in consumption subsidies, such as, for instance, the clean vehicle tax credit, that will ensure an uptake of different clean technologies. In that particular example, the uptake of clean vehicles. But there are also a wide range of sectors, especially aviation fuels, use of green hydrogen in the steel industry. There's a wide range of sectors that will benefit from the Inflation Reduction Act. If we look at free allowances, the focus area is drastically different. I would even say it's the exact opposite. So while in the US, IRA is supporting investment, so capital expenditure, free allowances happen to support operational expenditure, the everyday production of coal-based steel, for instance. So that's one major difference. Do you support investment or do you support, operational expenditure? So, day-to-day spending. And obviously the focus area is drastically different. Free allowances money does not go to green steel producers. It does go by design to the producers of polluting products, industrial products. And so to me, that's the major difference in the focus. If you allow me to oversimplify a bit, while the US is choosing to invest $40 billion per year more to subsidize clean technology, the EU is debating whether or not to continue to spend 40 billion euros per year to support dirty technology. And to me, that's really the major difference between the Inflation Reduction Act and EU ETS free allowances. So what to watch for during the negotiation? To me, there are two critical elements that can appear technical, but actually politically vital in terms of EU response to the Inflation Reduction Act. The first one is about how fast we phase out ETS free allowances. The faster we phase them out, the greater incentive we give to EU companies to produce cleanly in Europe. So the more we delay the phase out of free allowances, especially the starting date of the phase out of free allowances, the more likely we are to lose the global and clean technology race. Because the more it will delay the moment where the EU puts an actual carbon price on the industry, and therefore an actual an actual incentive for clean production to happen in Europe, rather than happen only in the US. The second element is the size of the EU Innovation Fund. Remember, I was telling you that one key element of the Inflation Reduction Act are production subsidies. The EU Innovation Fund is a way to do that, because you take part in capital expenditure, so therefore investment in specific projects that can deliver clean electricity, green steel, and so on and so on. And the EU Innovation Fund is to date the most important EU tool that we have to support clean technology in Europe. So if we increase, or rather if our elected officials choose to increase the Innovation Fund, then the Innovation Fund can become the cornerstone of the response to the Inflation Reduction Act. That would be a very positive development. However, that's not the trend, because yesterday, I think it was, here I will be using a word from an EPP MEP politician, I think it's Peter Lisa, who said that the Innovation Fund was, quote, plundered by member states, his word. And indeed, member states have chosen to take 10 billion euros away from the Innovation Fund to put that in REPowerEU, which will finance different elements, including some gas and oil infrastructure. So to me, what is happening today in Brussels is obviously super important with, the European Council, etc. But at least as importantly, maybe even more so for the future of Europe, that trialogue is critical. Because depending on what will happen during that trialogue, we'll be able to say whether or not the EU is able to step up its game, to continue on its long-term climate policy, but increase the speed in order to make sure that Europe stays one leader in the global clean tech race. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. Susanna, let me turn to you. I mean, you've, of course, been following the ETS for over a decade now, from a variety of different angles. I'm very curious to hear what you think the clean tech investors you represent, what will they be looking out for this weekend?
Thank you. Working, if not, I can take another one. Okay, great, no problem. Thank you so much, Damien, for the question. And I guess it would be really important to start by talking about the carbon price, because indeed the carbon price is a critical element for the clean tech community, but also for investors looking for certainty for their investors. So I will start by talking about the carbon price, not least because for the sort of technologies that we actually need to reach net zero by 2050, where many of the breakthrough innovations that need to occur in, let's say, sectors such as cement, steel, or chemicals, the carbon price that would be necessary would be somewhere in the range of 100 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent to all the way up to even 300 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent. And unfortunately, this carbon price has actually not been reached. These levels haven't been reached in the European Union yet. And part of the problem and the reason why they haven't been reached is, again, the free allocation system that Thomas referred to just earlier. Effectively, because of the amount of freely allocated permits on the market, this has actually given us relatively low prices, volatile prices, and that has actually failed to trigger the sort of investments that we need to see happening in Europe. The innovation that has happened inside the EU ETS when it comes to heavy industry has been incremental. And when we look at sort of the, let's say, percentages of reductions, they would put us on trajectories which are far into the horizon beyond the year 2100. So something does need to change quite drastically if we do want to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, and this revision is the revision to do it. In many ways, this revision of the EU ETS is part two of what was revised 5 years ago, because if you look at it, we're still talking about changes that will then come into effect in phase 4 of the EU ETS. And it is quite clear that we can't continue as we have up to now, not least because of the context in the United States, not least because we're actually not on trajectories to meet our goals. And we are very worried in Cleantech for Europe about the fact that some of the agreements from this week, including the agreement on Repower EU, actually risk put in jeopardy our competitiveness in the Cleantech race. And I will explain why that is by also focusing on two elements. For us, the Innovation Fund is also incredibly important, but so is the Market Stability Reserve. But let me start from the positive aspect of CBAM, which is really a fantastic agreement. It will be the first time in history we have such an instrument introduced, and it has 4 critical benefits, right? One is that it actually creates demand for low carbon goods. So we focus very much on supply side policies. We very clearly need to look at the demand side, and CBAM is the biggest policy in terms of what can trigger and really stimulate demand for low carbon products in the EU. Secondly, it also extends the EU carbon price outside of our jurisdiction. And in that sense, it actually levels the playing field, right? So we've heard industry for so many years talking about this, and actually it levels the playing field for our own consumption in the European Union as well. So in that sense, it is a very positive policy. It will yield convergence at the global level on monitoring, reporting, and verification, which means that there could be then convergence, and we could be talking about common standards in terms of clean technology development around the world as well, so that we make sure the world is actually developing towards the same goal, the goal of the Paris Agreement. And finally, it allows us to transition away from free allocations. And this is extremely important, as has been explained. Now, that won't be enough in itself. And this is why we come to the Innovation Fund, because the Innovation Fund is a tool for strategic investment in supporting clean tech development in Europe. Now, we've already heard from Thomas that it's actually being threatened at the moment, particularly by the idea that we could take allowances from it and then move them to Repower EU. And then towards the end of phase 4, this is what the agreement was, we could replenish the Innovation Fund with other allowances. But honestly, the critical window for investments in clean technologies is from now, 2022, one could say from yesterday, but let's say from now, 2022 to 2025. So having a response from the EU that actually diminishes the size of the Innovation Fund in the short term is the equivalent of us walking in the opposite direction of the Inflation Reduction Act in the European Union. So it's the wrong response at the wrong point in time. And certainly it's not necessary. The reason why it's not necessary is that thanks to the introduction of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, we're also going to have a lot of free allocations that we thought would be allocated to heavy industry sectors, but they will be freed up because CBAM now will cover some of that. So there would be allowances under the ETS to actually boost up substantially the Innovation Fund without needing to diminish it or even look into the Market Stability Reserve, which I will cover immediately after that. So just to summarize, the most important thing for the Innovation Fund as a geopolitical response would actually be to ensure that it's enlarged in size, to also grow its scope so that we don't just develop innovation in Europe, but we also scale it up in Europe. Because of course, the issue is, and this is what we're hearing in the innovator community, the proposition from the United States is very attractive. And so in order to keep companies and innovators in the European Union, we have to actually grow the focus of the Innovation Fund to become an innovation and a scale-up fund. And there would be allowances in the ETS to do that. This is incredibly important. And now I will move to the second point, which is the Market Stability Reserve. Yesterday morning, with the Repower EU negotiations having reached, let's say, their pre-final point, because of course, everything related to the ETS is still to be decided, we heard the negative news that the Market Stability Reserve is being offered up for, let's say, for allowances from it to be taken out, auctioned, and then eventually put back into the Innovation Fund. Now, this is an extremely dangerous signal to market confidence. This is the Market Stability Reserve is the reason why the carbon price has now reached quite an important level, quite close to the level that we would need to see decarbonization in Europe happening, but offering to actually unsettle the main instrument that has been stabilizing the ETS throughout a global pandemic, that has been stabilizing the carbon price throughout this past year, where we have seen shocks in supply chains. We are unfortunately faced with an atrocious war in Europe. So offering up the one instrument of stability could only yield further chaos and further uncertainty when it comes to the carbon price. And that is not what we need. This is not what investors would appreciate, because obviously there has to be some sort of visibility, some sort of predictability. And Europe does not have a carbon floor price to offer that in let's say, in exchange for the market stability reserve, right? So the market stability reserve is the main instrument that guarantees the stability, the predictability, and the robustness of the EU carbon price. The moment we offer to interfere with it at the end of phase 4, we actually open up the whole system to even more volatility. This could decrease the size of the innovation fund. This could decrease the size of all the funds effectively, as they're dependent on the carbon price, but also just lower the prospects for investments in Europe. So unfortunately, the news from this week has been really positive on the CBAM front, but quite worrying on the Repower EU side. And once again, if we do think in the European Union, and this seems to be the main message, that we can postpone joining the Cleantech race for, let's say, end of phase 4 of the ETS, the second part of the 2020s, we might have as well lost the race by then. So the next 3 years are critical for this. They're critical. That's why the US is moving really fast, and we need to really seize the moment and make the most out of the opportunities we have. And CBAM does give us a huge opportunity to grow the innovation fund and also safeguard the integrity of the MSR. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Susanna. I hope the microphone works there, by the way, but let me turn to Agnese. We've heard from colleagues quite a bit about how the ETS can be important in driving clean tech investments and making sure that those clean tech actors are not right and are not put on a bad footing compared to some of the incumbents. But let's not forget that first and foremost, this is a climate policy and it's aimed at reducing or achieving a certain emission reduction goal. So I'm very curious to hear your take on sort of the discussions on the overall level of ambition of the ETS and where you think that is going.
Yeah, thank you very much, Samin, and thank you for Cleantech for Europe for inviting us to this press briefing, and good morning, everyone. Indeed, my name is Agnese Ruggiero, and I'm policy lead at Carbon Market Watch. For those of you who don't know, Carbon Market Watch is an international NGO working on climate policy, and specifically, as the name goes, we work on carbon pricing policies. And indeed, today, this morning, I would like to offer a slightly different perspective from what we've heard so far, from climate and social perspective, and how important the revision of the EU ETS is in this context, since the ETS is first and foremost a climate policy tool that will help reduce emissions in the sectors covered, namely power and energy, but also aviation and potentially shipping, and then aside road transport and buildings potentially as well. The point is that of this revision is to meet the renewed EU climate targets, and that's why the tool is reformed and should be strengthened. And so one of the key elements of this reform, as the trialogues have proceeded throughout the autumn, is still being negotiated, is the overall target, the ambition. Where should we get to? The crucial question of how much will the ETS sectors contribute to the 2030 EU climate target? And the problem so far, the ugly truth of this revision, is that none of the options on the table are actually going to help the EU meet its 2030 and let alone its 2050 climate target and fulfill its commitment under the Paris Agreement of contributing to keeping the temperature below 1.5 degrees, because to actually contribute to this target, the EU should reduce its emission by 65% by 2030, not 55. And the ETS sectors, which basically are responsible for almost half of Europe's emissions, should reduce their carbon pollution by 70% by 2030. And the options on the table for the trialogue this weekend, and that have been discussed so far, look at a 61 to maybe 63% emission reductions by 2030. This is not nearly enough. And the ambition of our policymakers, of our co-legislators, has diminished, if anything, in the last months, because we've had the energy crunch, we've had the Russian attack on Ukraine, then the announcement of the US Inflation Reduction Act. Instead of propelling us to be more ambitious and to invest more, has just been exploited as another pretext to shield industries from paying the carbon price, from lowering our ambition, for weakening our climate policies. And this is very damaging and short-sighted, because among all these issues that we have, climate change remains one of the biggest, and the biggest of our time, and all its consequences that it will bring in terms of environmental disaster and social and political unrest. In terms of, as we promised, some scenarios, I will have to look at what the options on the table are for this trialogue this weekend. And so I can safely say that the best outcome for this revision will be the one that eventually our co-legislators agree that will yield the faster and reduction in emissions and the largest reduction. For those who are more familiar with the options on the table, the European Parliament's position would be a little closer to where we need to go. So almost 63% with a faster reduction and lower carbon budget overall, so lower emissions from now to 2030. This seems to be not entirely the direction where we're going. So I would say that instead our worst scenario would be to have the opposite, to not have reduction in emissions, even in starting in 2024 with a one-off cut. If this is not high enough, we're not going to meet the 2030 target. If the yearly reduction of emissions, the so-called linear reduction factor, if it's not strengthened enough, we're not going to meet even the 63% reduction by 2030. And this would then seriously undermine Europe's ability to tackle climate change and will leave us stranded with large amounts of pollution and with its harmful consequences. And clearly, as my colleagues have outlined, also no investments and not enough money for the renewable energy and the clean technologies that are needed to meet our midterm and long-term targets. I would just want to outline a second element of this revision that is not only about ambition, but it's about what the key issues that are remaining on the table this weekend are about. For now, what we've seen, the trilogue negotiators have very much focused on what was easier to agree on, right? They have look, besides the agreement also reached on the carbon border adjustment mechanism and REPowerEU, there has been some provisional agreements within the ETS in the trilogue. And what's been agreed is massive exemptions for the steel sector, for example. We talked about the monetary value of free emission allowances. We're just going to give more to a sector that is one of the most polluting in Europe. We have agreed to put a price on imports, but we haven't agreed yet on when and how fast the free pollution permits to our domestic producers will be phased out. We have agreed to take out money from the modernization from the market stability reserve to give it to the innovation fund to support industries, but we haven't agreed on the target by which these very industries will reduce their emissions. So all the harder and more socially important elements are still very much open on the table, which are how much emissions are reduced, that the pollution is paid for, that the carbon price is strong, that the revenues are recycled towards climate action. And these are absolutely necessary changes that will need to come into effect, because these are the only and the most important elements that then will also make all the easier and the carrots that are being given effective. Because without a strong carbon price, without a strong market and a resilient market, then all the investments, all the giveaways will not be effective, and then co-legislators will be simply shooting themselves in the foot. So this weekend is an opportunity for the policymakers to agree on a balanced and fair transition that helps and boosts investment, but also ensures that emissions are reduced, and anything less will be meaningless. Thank you.
Thanks, Agnese. Those were some very clear, although not always very rosy expectations for this weekend. Camille, let me turn to you. WWF recently published a major report on free allocation, as well as on the use of revenues by member states. So very curious, in light of that report, to hear what your expectations are for the weekend.
Yes, thank you, Domine, and thank you, Cleantech for Europe, for the invitation. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Camille Maury. I work at WWF, the European office, and I wanted to start with maybe the reality we live in. We all know that we have very little time to act if we want to keep global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees and to stop runaway climate change. Actually, the next year, the years up to 2030 are crucial, not only for industrial decarbonization, but also for protecting people against the cost of the transition, and also to protect our planet. As clearly outlined by Agnese and all my colleagues here, a successful revision of the EU ETS should make the ETS a tool that incentivizes emission reduction. To do that, it was already outlined, we really need to raise the overall ETS ambition, and we also need to phase out the free ETS allowances. But we also need to look at how we spend all the money generated through the sale of all the ETS emission allowances. We need to spend this money on climate action and not on financing counterproductive projects that will actually lock us even further in fossil fuel dependency. So to start with the phase out of free allowances, as explained very well before by Domine, the principle of the ETS is that industry have to buy emission allowances that are on the market. Thus, they pay a price for their pollution, and so it means they have an incentive to decarbonize. But yet, the last WWF report on ETS revenue, which I have here, and it's called "Where Did All the Money Go?" And we could have called it also "Money, Money, Money," from a famous song of ABBA. I'm looking at Ola here. Show that the last 9 years, actually, over half of the pollution covered by ETS was emitted for free. So it's about 53% to be precise. This is because over the years, the past 9 years, industry have been given a lot of free allowances. Since 2013, those free allowances that we also called free permits to pollute were worth nearly 100 billion euros, 98.5 billion to be precise. So you could argue, wow, that's a huge number. Okay, if it helps to decarbonize industry, that's maybe worth it. But that's the main problem. Free permits to pollute doesn't help reduce emission. It's actually counterproductive. And it's not only us around this table saying that. It was actually said by the Court of Auditors, mentioned in its last report in 2020, that ETS allowances, free ETS allowances, sorry, needed better targeting. So nearly 100 billion euro. It's a huge amount of money that could instead be used to finance climate action and industrial decarbonization. So on this rationale, we should think, okay, we have to stop with giving free permits to pollute to industry, especially because we are living in a time that we are now having co-legislators thinking of installing an ETS2 and a social climate fund. And when you look at the numbers, it's quite shocking that the amount of free permits to pollute that we will give to industry until 2032 will be almost three times higher than the pots of the social climate fund, which will be given to citizens to bear the cost of the ETS2 creation. So in a time where we are thinking of establishing a CBAM, and we co-legislators almost agree on that one, it will have to be agreed also with the ETS on Friday and Saturday. Free permits to pollute looked even more as an unjustified solution at the moment to decarbonize our industry. That's why actually we will be looking at on Friday and Saturday for co-legislators to really phase out free ETS allowances for CBAMs as quickly as possible, and especially to phase them out by 50% by 2030. We will also be looking at how co-legislators agree on another important issue, which is how EU countries must spend their ETS revenue. So in this report, my colleague, Romain, actually looked at all public data available from member states, all their reports, and also from data from the European Environmental Agency. And he found out that if you look at how much countries received in terms of ETS revenue, it's like about 88.5 billion euros. So it's huge money. So how was it spent? Basically, EU countries spend a little bit more than 2/3 of their ETS revenue on climate action. So it's about 72%. But this 72% is really questionable, because if you really look in detail, it has been spent on what we can call unproductive of climate spending, ETS revenue spent on any type of climate project as counting as climate action. For example, in some EU countries, you can find that the money was sometimes spent on modernizing coal infrastructure, or spent also on biomass projects. And those for us is highly questionable. So that's why another thing we will be looking at as a result of the negotiation this weekend is for co-legislators to agree on 100% of the EU ETS revenue to be spent on climate action, and also on defining better what constitutes a climate action. So at the moment, the European Commission and the Parliament could agree on this, but the main blockers are EU countries. So to sum up, what we will be looking at is a very early phase out of reallocation in order to stop this huge amount of money given to industry, and instead auction allowances and redistribute these auction allowances to green transition, especially through the Innovation Fund. We'll be also looking at co-legislators to really impose clear definition of what constitutes a climate spending, and also use 100% of ETS revenue on climate action. Thank you.
Thanks, Camille. Yeah, before opening the floor for questions, let me turn to the screen first to Ola. In Sweden, I mean, you represent a company that is, well, whose aim is it to produce 5 million tons of green steel annually by 2030, if I recall correctly, which obviously requires massive amounts of investments, the right regulatory incentives, and the right levels of support and level playing field. So with that in mind, what are your expectations for the weekend, and what are some of the crucial elements you will be looking at?
Yes, thank you. I think we have been following the process for more than a year now, since we started our existence, really for more than 1.5 years ago, I would say. And of course, it's been the questions how you incentivize industrial decarbonization, and also the question of level playing field in the EU. And I think currently we see there's a lot of rules and processes that do not create a level playing field. They favor existing industry or big emitters, or industries in certain countries where there is a willingness to really give a lot of subsidies, for example. So I think that's where we have been pushed for. And I just wanted to start about us. I mean, we are an industrial startup, a purpose-driven company with the aim and purpose to decarbonize hard-to-abate industries, and we start with steel. When we say hard-to-abate industries, we mean the sectors that so far have been it's been really hard to find technologies and ways to decarbonize them. But now there is solutions in many of these sectors, like the steel industry. Also, you can go to maritime fertilizers, for example, and in many of these sectors, it's the green hydrogen that will be the solution, and that's what we're going to use as well. And we will produce green hydrogen based on renewable electricity to start our first project here in northern Sweden, which is the plant you talked about. And we plan to start commercial operation already in 2025. Groundworks have been started, and it's going to have 3 parts. It's going to be a hydrogen producing plant, iron producing plant, and a steel plant. And with the new processes, we're going to reduce the emissions with more than 90% compared to the best blast furnaces in Europe today, which is sort of the common route to produce primary steel in Europe. And we're come a long way. We have the loan secured, we have our permits there, and we are also part of the equity there. But that's what's left. So we're going to raise the rest of the equity now, and the plan is to reach financial close during first half next year. And we also have a pipeline of several projects, one on the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal or Spain, and also in Brazil. And also to mention here, we heard Susanna earlier here, we're one of the 8 founders of this scale-up coalition group in the Cleantech for Europe initiative, really pushing for the EU policy to make it possible for these new innovations and clean tech companies to scale and become really large ones. So ETS, I think what we heard a lot already here, and I think for us, one major topic when it comes to incentivizing industrial decarbonization has been the free allocation phase out. As we heard here, almost in the industry, almost all emissions are covered by the free allocation. So the existing industries only pay for, if some none, but the ones that pay only for a very small share of their emissions. The rest are covered with the free allocation. So there is no real cost. The polluter pays principle isn't really introduced yet in the industry, in the EU industry. And with the CBAM now and the current package, there is a possibility really, as we heard, to introduce this. And we have had a much more sort of ambitious position than what is now on the table to really have a quick phase out of the free allocation. I think what we see now and expect for the weekend as a best outcome is that the free allocation phase out and the CBAM phase in, the costs there start in 2026, and that we reach a 50% phase out by 2030. I think that's the best option on the table currently, and I mean, and then the rest is phased out years before 2035. That's what we hope for, and I think anything less is, of course, a failure for the climate and for the competitiveness of the ones that are looking for decarbonization in the industry. Another aspect here on the incentivize is also, as we heard, in the EU Innovation Fund, and of course, we are very disappointed with the decision to take a large chunk out of the Innovation Fund to support the Repower EU. I think it's the totally opposite of what really is needed, especially considering that this the EU level support is something that really can accelerate the investments. And in order to meet the targets of the Green Deal, not only the climate targets, but also competitiveness and a sort of very and economic growth. I mean, we really would need to have these investments now. And if you take away the Innovation Fund these years, it means you delay a lot of investments. It's, if you look on the current sort of rounds of the Innovation Fund, if you compare the projects that applied and how much approvals you got, it's a lot less than 10%. So there's really a lot of projects out there that can, if they get the funds, can accelerate their financing and get the projects off the ground. And I think here, at best, we're looking at the doubling of the current funding from the ETS as an outcome from the scheme. There could unfortunately be a lot less. And I think here the carve out for the Repower is a really sad story, but we hope for a doubling at least in the outcome. When it comes to level playing field, of course, again, the Innovation Fund needs to treat the existing industry and new industries in the same way. And here we see more on the process side. It's not been decisions taken there. Maybe there could be some language in the directive now also securing that also startup companies have the same ability to get the funding. But maybe most important when it comes to the level playing field is the benchmarks that govern the free allocation. And with the benchmark we have now in the steel sector and in the cement sector, if you, as an incumbent, invest in a carbonized production process, you lose almost all your free allocation. You are not any longer getting free allocation based on the same benchmark, which is and the free allocation you get is much lower than the ones keeping the high emitting process, which is a total disincentive. It disincentivizes every decision to invest in these routes. So here we really need this process neutral benchmarks that gives the same kind of same level of free allocation to the same. If you produce a product, if it's a carbonized route or a high emitting route, you get the same kind of free allocation, especially now when we see that free allocation will probably be going on for quite more than a decade from now. So I think this is really important. Here we've seen some positive steps actually in the negotiations, and it's likely that we get wording here that is going in the right direction. But then the Commission also needs to do the work on the delegated act, the subordinated legislation in order to implement this. So this is a two-step process, but here it's been some progress really in the negotiations. I think a final comment is in the ETS is also the ability to give certain supports, which is sort of not unevenly distributed among the EU member states. And here, I think Camille mentioned this, and it's mentioned in the report by WWF, is the ability to give the indirect cost compensation for electricity prices. And here, this is something that member states can do. Only 13 of 27 countries have done that during the last period. And it's really very different levels in different countries. So this is an area where it's a total unlevel playing field in EU. And here, I think there should be a new model. You have this, if you have this support, if you keep it, it should be on an EU level, but preferably it should be taken away as we see it. I'll stop there, and happy to answer any questions if there are.
Thanks so much, Ola. So I'm going to open the floor now for questions, both here in the room as well as online. I think colleague can signal if there are any questions. So if you hear from a number of experts that have been following this for a long time, please feel free to just raise your hand, maybe stand up and say your affiliation and your question and who it is directed to. But yeah. There's a mic, I think.
Hi, Alice Hancock, Financial Times. I just wanted to ask a bit about CBAM. I think we actually spoke yesterday. I just wondered if you guys had any thoughts on what happens to the CBAM revenues, because as I understand it at the moment, it looks like it's going into own resources, but there's obviously some debate about whether that should be going to help countries decarbonize themselves, other third countries, and could that be used more effectively? And also this sort of missing piece on CBAM about export rebates. I don't know if this comes into your purview so much, but I was hoping that you might have some views that you could share on, you know, if that is included in the final agreement, then what will be the impact of that? Thanks.
Maybe let's collect one or two questions more, and then if there are other questions, then I can hand it over here. I think it was a hand. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the briefing. Federica Di Sario from Politico. I mean, listening to you and also to every ETS experts, it seems very clear this connection between the IRA and the ETS and the fact that we can leverage the innovation fund to do as the most obvious response to what the US have done. But if you listen to the leaders, like today, they're going to talk about the IRA in the council, and I'm sure that nobody is going to talk about the ETS. Do you think it's a lack of understanding? Do you think it's like, why doesn't it make it to a more high level discussion? Yeah. Basically, it seems just a discussion that we are having among us, but it's difficult to make it understandable for people that are not ETS enthusiasts. And also similar to that, like a question about CBAM. I had a colleague who's on the climate team, but he didn't get that CBAM would actually apply to every country that doesn't have a carbon pricing system. So this is also not very clear for a lot of people. Of course, if you cover it, you know, because you know, they have made very clear that it's not going to apply to, I mean, it's going to apply to every country that doesn't have an explicit carbon pricing. But if you are outside the debate, it's not clear. Like, you just got it yesterday that it would hit the US. So why do you think it doesn't escalate more? Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe one last question here, and then I'll look back.
Okay, Andrea Mogni, I'm a consultant. For a follow-up, the question on CBAM. It will be, I mean, I've seen some reports made by think tanks about the objective difficulty to implement this strategy, this control, which has to take place at the border level. We need the computer, we need the knowledge, we need the manpower, we need infrastructures. And essentially also we needed to know how and to what extent an exporter a country outside European Union is incorporating climate considerations in the production of their own items, which are going to be exported to Europe. There is, of course, a first analysis which needs to be made on the product, but also a second analysis which needs to be made on how the electricity has been taken into consideration in order to produce the product that eventually is exported to Europe. I don't know if Europe has this capacity to make this kind of examination, this kind of analysis. How long does it take? For how many countries around the world exporting items to Europe? And then, of course, it's a matter of using the revenue of CBAM in some to redistribute it to member states or to the European Union as a kind of pool, financial pool. So the implementation of CBAM is, I mean, I see it very, very difficult. In addition, according to my knowledge and my information, many European partner countries consider CBAM as a kind of protectionist measure. So CBAM is also exposes Europe to retaliation. And there is the main issue if it's compatible with WTO disciplines. So this is on CBAM. I would like to have some information from you, some inputs from you. On ETS, there is a lot of greenwashing, as Camilla has said, but we have also the taxonomy. I mean, there is this huge document made up by high-level expert groups, 350 pages. Sector by sector, it is indicated what are the activities that can be considered climate eligible, which needs to be implemented. So, I mean, we have this work available, and therefore this is a good indication, a good direction, a good orientation also for investors. On ETS pricing, allowances, there is, please do not forget that there are a lot of speculations. Prices tend to vary. There are reports indicating how much profit companies have made in order to buy and to sell these allowances. So there is also a speculative element which needs to be taken into consideration. And of course, there is, I mean, my personal advice, my personal impression is that as soon as we stop the distribution of free allowances is better. 25, 26, 27, or even 2030 is too far. This should be done tomorrow after. I mean, the system is already there. Companies, enterprises, installations are already full of time to adjust. So for them, it should not be a surprise. Phase 4 review should not be surprised. And my final comment is the following. We have to see things before the aggression, before the war in Ukraine, and after the war in Ukraine. Repower Europe is an emergency reaction to the war in Ukraine, and therefore now it needs to be financed. The idea, you remember, was to replicate the good example of the RRP. The idea was to have, once again, issuing European bonds in order to finance European energy recovery. But this proposal was fully rejected by the Germans. So a second example of an RRP related to energy is impossible. So if we want to cope with reducing the dependency on the Russian energy, if we wanted to finance construction of LNG terminals, pipelines, etc., we need to find money, not from the market, as we have done for RRP, but from other sources of income. And one of them is the Innovation Fund. Yeah. These are my comments. I don't know if you have reactions to these comments.
Thanks so much for the questions and comments. I'm sure there will be reactions. There were like several buckets. Let's maybe do the CBAM questions first, then go to the ETS related ones, and then IRA at the end. I don't know who wants to comment first. Susanna?
Sure. I'm happy to start with the question on the difficulty of implementing CBAM due to the fact that we actually need to start an MRV system. And I just want to put it in perspective and say that effectively, this is what net zero is. It's a huge accounting project. And the world has signed up to such a project when we've committed to reaching carbon neutrality in the second half of the century. So first of all, this sort of monitoring of emissions globally has to happen as part of us implementing the Paris Agreement. Secondly, thanks to satellite data, I don't see how this would actually be such a problem. We are nonetheless in 2022, and this would actually be should be more feasible that when we started doing the MRV for the ETS, which by the way, I know it's hard to believe, but it was also started from scratch. Right, so there was also a trial phase there. At the same way, we're going to have a trial phase in CBAM for a couple of years, exactly to learn how to develop this data collection methodology. Now, presuming that there's no satellite data available, that there's no other way, we can still use proxy estimates, right? So we can apply the average carbon intensity of a specific region or country that we're looking at. So you know, in a sense, that would actually be disadvantageous to the innovators in those countries, and hence why I think governments around the world would actually be encouraged to provide data so that innovators in their countries are not put at disadvantage through the application of an average carbon intensity proxy on the imports. So there are many ways to do this, and indeed it will be challenging, and we need to all be constructively working towards this goal, but it is not impossible, and most importantly, it's necessary. Also on CBAM, there was a question on export rebates and where would the CBAM money go? As far as I understand, and I've looked into the topic, I've been working on the CBAM since 2016, the money has to actually go to the EU budget. But having said that, there's nothing to prevent the European Union from deciding that from its own budget, it will create something of an innovation fund for the rest of the world to apply to or to be sort of allocated as part of a different set of conversations that take place either at COP or in other different kind of arrangements. So the EU, this shouldn't stop the EU, quite the opposite, it should encourage the EU. To go courageously and boldly in that direction. My understanding is that export rebates are actually not compatible with WTO law, but I guess we will have to see. We will have to see that. I would imagine that from outside of the world, like if you're actually based in the US, you would see this as a protectionist move, but again, I think the issue of WTO compatibility is the biggest one, and the EU has committed to proposing a mechanism that is WTO compatible. So perhaps it's in a sense we're even looking at a red herring. I mean, it's a distraction from what we should be talking about, knowing that this is a bit outside of the scope of what we can legally offer. So I can stop there, but eventually I'd like to comment on questions from Federica on IRA. Yes.
Sure. Agnès, do you want to come in on revenues and?
Does this work now? Yeah.
I think so.
Okay. I would, yes, indeed, address the question around the CBAM revenues, because Susanna, you mentioned they should be going into the EU budget. That's where apparently they are going. This was the original proposal of the European Commission, but unfortunately, it seems that the CBAM deal on Monday also goes in this direction, while the European Parliament has suggested something different, which would have been much better also in terms of the optics, really, of not making CBAM look protectionist, and also have a much more sort of a collaborative spirit and the solidarity nature in it. By the idea would have been from the European Parliament to assign the revenues of CBAM certificates to support least developed countries in their efforts to decarbonize. And so some of those that are affected by CBAM, since they're exporters, for example, of certain primary materials like aluminium, the final agreement in Parliament was to earmark an equivalent amount of money, so not to use directly these revenues, but at least have them flow in the European budget, and then earmark within the European budget an equivalent amount to support these countries, and was already a decent idea that has been completely dropped in the agreement on Monday, which is really a pity, really, because indeed, like it takes away the whole more collaborative approach to CBAM. On export rebates, if I may, I also seem to have the understanding, as indicated multiple times by the European Commission, that this type of scheme wouldn't be compatible with WTO rules. But I would also probably want to have a look at the impact on exports that CBAM and the reduction of free allowances as a consequence has, because it will have a bigger impact for certain sectors and less so for others. So maybe a solution, if it has to be found, because indeed we are talking about support through innovation. We're talking about the fact that free allowances are not needed. So I'm not sure that they're needed for even the export productions, but if there is an impact assessment shows an actual problem, then we would need to see the solution for the specific problem in the specific sectors and concern. Thanks.
Thanks, Agnese. Does anyone else want to comment on CBAM specifically? Yeah.
One word on the way CBAM is perceived in the US. So indeed, at first, there was this impression that it was some kind of a protectionist measure, but I mean, I also been engaged with extensive discussion with the Biden administration and also the Congress to explain that this clearly isn't. It's about the level playing field. And one thing, especially in the US case, is that they understand that they are not concerned by CBAM just because they do not export to the EU the kind of goods that are under CBAM. If you look at trade flows between the EU and the US, if you allow me to oversimplify, we Europeans export manufactured goods to the US, including cars and stuff. They export services. And therefore, services are not covered by CBAM, at least not for now, not for the foreseeable future. Interestingly, and that will also allow me to answer the element of, the differentiation between what was good before Putin's second invasion of Ukraine on February 2022 and now. If you look before that, when we thought about CBAM, and if you look at the countries that were concerned, clearly there were two ones that were absolutely concerned by CBAM, and those were our main exporters of steel and cement, Russia and Ukraine. Obviously, for reasons that have nothing to do with CBAM, that's clearly no longer the case. We are not looking at any export of Russian steel and cement to EU anymore, not as a result of CBAM, obviously. And I mean, what's left of the Ukrainian steel and cement production, as if you allow me to speak in cynical economist terms, a domestic market that is in high demand for those goods. So what that changes a lot the diplomatic dimension of CBAM. Because now we're talking about implementing CBAM that will concern countries that we don't really know yet who they are. And those countries will be new exporters to the EU. So therefore, I personally have no fear that those countries will see that as an exporting measure, because in 2021, those countries exported close to nothing to the EU. And now they will be exporting more and more steel and cement because they will be taking market shares that are being lost, but that have been lost now by Russian and Ukrainian exporters to the EU. So from them, they know CBAM from the get-go. And so therefore, to me, that eases a lot the diplomatic tension that we had in the past around CBAM.
Thanks, Thomas. There were a few questions around the ETS specifically. One was why, I guess we're all talking about the IRA and then putting it in connection with ETS, but that doesn't seem to be on the heads or on the minds of political leaders. Another comment that was made was around the fact that, and I think it's very well true, like the EU is tight on cash, and absent any revision to fiscal rules, we will continue when stuff happens reaching in the ETS pocket. I don't know if anyone has any reflections on either of those questions.
I mean, to me, the political pressure is so intense that we will see an increase of public spending. The question is whether this is done through national measures in an uncoordinated manner, which, I mean, has been the situation since October 2021, when member states started to spend more than, in total, 400 billion euros of fossil fuel subsidies, or whether we do that in a EU coordinated manner. And so that allows me to also answer the question of why on earth, the European Council is not talking about the Innovation Fund as an answer to the Inflation Reduction Act, because some national governments see IRA as an opportunity to push for what they wanted before, so changes in fiscal rules, Stability and Growth Pact, state aid rules also, and more largely competition policy. To me, it's the countries that oppose those moves that should come up with the Innovation Fund. It's countries like Sweden, like the Netherlands, like Finland, that understand the risk that comes with giving too much flexibility on competition policy, too much flexibility on the economic governance framework. Those countries should lead and support an EU action, because that's the way out. And so I very much believe that one thing that makes the EU great is with people start with different positions, and in the end we find a third position that is much better. It's the Hegelian concept of Aufheben, and that's one thing that can happen, and I hope that will happen. And so therefore the Aufheben exercise here is to go beyond the existing starting position from member states, and the solution to me has to do with some form of EU climate investment plan, of which the EU Innovation Fund is a tool that already exists, that is already there, and that we can already beef up.
Thank you very much. I'll also pick up on this point and Federica's question on the disconnect that exists between the discussions in Council even today and the sort of context that we are describing and talking about. Indeed, some of the negotiations we are going to witness today and over the weekend carry with them an inertia of past times. And there is a problem with that because effectively, even now, this ETS revision that's amending the second half of phase 4 is dealing with homework undone in the previous revision when it was not actually possible to get a CBAM through. So the question is, why hasn't Europe, the European Union in 2022, awakened to the fact that this inertia of the homework undone is dragging it behind, right? Because unfortunately, we knew before the war against Ukraine started that energy independence was a strategic goal of the European Union. And this has been built into the energy union since the beginning of the project. The idea was to actually move away from dependency on Russian imports. And we've taken far too long to get to that stage. As a result, we're not there yet. And so now I really hope we can avoid the same type of situation happening on Cleantech development, because we do see it in the political speeches. Thank you, Thomas, for bringing up the speech from the 4th of December. So yes, it is a strategic priority of the EU, but if today's negotiations or this weekend's negotiations actually mean that we'll only get around to tackling the issue in the 2030s, that will also be too late. So how do we start moving at faster speed in the European Union? I think it requires a lot of self-reflection, but also the understanding that the status quo needs to change. So we do need to make these bold decisions. Now is the moment to make them, because we should have probably made them yesterday. And the future we're trying to build is very much going to be determined by our decisions over the next 2 or 3 years. So I rest there. I guess everyone wants to answer on the ETS question, so I suggest we. Oh, and Ola. Okay, so.
Yeah, I think I connect to Thomas here, and I think really good. I echo what you said, and I think that's the worries we have, that now it's each country by itself, each member state by itself, try to match, or at least to some degree balance the US IRA, since you don't have the fiscal sort of, you can't take fiscal regulation on the EU level in the same way as the tax reductions made in the Inflation Reduction Act. So I think really what we would like to see also is that EU acts here in a coordinated way. Now we see a lot of attempts on member states level to match this, the IRA, and especially the big ones with big pockets and a tradition of subsidies are going really full frontier on supporting industry, which is not good for the EU internally and the internal market, and not in the long term either, because there's a risk that we not support the most efficient companies going forward, the ones that will be the ones that increase the competitiveness of the union as a whole. So really just echoing there that I really also stress that there needs to be a coordinated approach on the EU level. And I think, I mean, also CBAM, I didn't answer there, but I think I totally agree. We need something that is both acceptable by other countries and WTO compatible. And so when it comes to incomes and the export rebates, this has to, any such sort of solutions need to be with the focus of compatible with WTO and acceptable to other countries. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Camille or Agnese, do you also want to come in?
Yeah, no, maybe just also to echo what has been said, we really need to change the statu quo. Like there is little time to act, like 2030, sorry, it's tomorrow, really. So little time to act. So let's see what's going to happen over the weekend. And maybe to go back on the question on CBAM, I think it's really legitimate to ask ourselves where the money is going, because now that we have a broader scope, like with the inclusion of hydrogen and also the maybe inclusion of indirect emission and maybe up to 2030 more sector, it will raise much more revenue. Like we are talking about maybe 14 billion euros per year. So it's quite some money. So it's really legitimate to ask ourselves where this money is going. So we were quite disappointed that actually co-legislator agreed so far, because it's a provisional deal, to give this money to the EU budget.
Thanks, Camille. I don't know if there are any other questions, either in the room or online. I don't think so. Not online. Then, I don't know, Susanna, shall I hand it back to you for some concluding words? Or
could I just add? I mean, on the mission, we had some questions here on the emission reporting. I think it's good to highlight that we also have now the battery regulation, which is a front runner legislation really here, going even further, I would say, than the CBAM, requiring the ones that import batteries or cars with batteries to cover the emissions in the whole value chain, and also in the long run setting thresholds where batteries with embedded emissions over certain levels cannot be put on the European market. So I think we will see this development going forward, and I think it's going to also in that legislation, it's a learning curve first, and then you set sort of the thresholds and the classes, different categories come into force. But I think it's a development we will see, and we will learn. And I think it's something that can push decarbonization both in EU and outside EU. We have already seen this, for example, with the emission levels on regular petrol and diesel cars having impact also outside EU. So I think this is a development that not only CBAM is contributing to, it's other. We will see it in other product regulation on EU level going forward as well. So I think we're at the beginning, but it will not stop.
Can I just add a thought on the complexity of the implementation of CBAM? I would say the European Union has a ton of experience, years of experience in ETS and monitoring, verification, and reporting of emissions. So it is a methodology that is perfectly within reach to develop and to also offer help to trade partners to then have them implement a similar methodology, and companies that import to verify the data that they receive. And the whole transition period will serve as a dry run, really, as a exercise to make sure that once then it starts collecting revenues through the certificates, it works and it's a smooth implementation. And to Federica, I would say that perhaps the reason why member states don't catch up so quickly on using ETS as funding revenues for industrial innovation and green transition is because ETS generates revenues for member states first and foremost, and then is looked at as a European funding tool. And member states are very much attached to the revenues that they collect from the carbon market, and the fact, and it also goes to show with the fact that several member states are opposing the mandatory spending of 100% of the revenues for climate action, because it is a lot of money that then right now only 50% should go to climate action. It effectively isn't, but the other half and a lot of these revenues are then spent to plug holes in national budgets. That's the reality. So it's not. That's why the link perhaps is not made. It's not lack of knowledge, it's lack of will of using ETS revenues for the purpose of the ETS for climate.
So I think in wrapping up the session, as I understand, there are no further questions. Maybe it's good to end a bit with a positive and an optimistic look towards the weekend. So first of all, despite let's see what's been said on the EU, US, different angles, there has been and there is continued progress on the technical discussions between the two, including in the context of TTC, the Trade and Technology Council. So there are many discussions going ahead very constructively and positively. There's also of course, the CBAM agreement, which confirms that it will start as a trial phase, and then, of course, giving us the opportunity to really figure out and learn and develop from experience. Another good element to the story is that the negotiations are still ahead, so nothing really terrible has yet been agreed. Hopefully the MSR will be maintained, and then we can actually see a carbon price at the end of the year that's not, let's say, crashing and on a downwards trajectory. And also, most importantly, the fact that we've all come together today, and I wanted to really thank you for your presence here. I think this is just meant as actually as a starter of conversation. So I very much hope we can stay connected, and feel free to reach out to any of my colleagues, to myself, to we should actually keep these dialogues going into the future, because of course it will take all of us to come up with the exact the right questions, the right kind of answers, the right strategy for the future. So I think 2023 will be a critical year for us in trying to develop a clean tech strategy for the EU. So we very much hope you'll follow our work, but also we hope to take inspiration and input from you. So yeah, don't hesitate to be in touch. So thank you very much, and have a nice rest of the day. Bye.